Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation of Mourning in the Morning, a partnership between the Rochester Public Library and the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery. I'm Brandon Fess, the Special Collections Librarian with the Local History and Genealogy Division at the Rochester Public Library. Today's presentation is Selden's Seldom Remembered, an illustrious family of groundbreakers and innovators. I was really excited when Sally presented this topic to us, as the Seldens are an often discussed and yet pretty unknown family, especially in 19th century Rochester. Hailing from Connecticut and settling in early 19th century Rochester, the Selden family was known for keen legal and judicial minds, as well as technical innovation. From the formation of Western Union to the defense of Susan B. Anthony to the invention of the gas automobile, their innovations in many areas led to where we are today. Ultimately buried at Mount Hope Cemetery, we'll share their stories and contributions to Rochester, the nation, and the world. Today's presenter is Sally Millick. Sally is a past trustee and longtime cemetery tour author, researcher, and guide with the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery. She is currently a board member of the Friends and Foundation of Rochester Public Library. She's contributed to several books on history of upstate New York and Mount Hope Cemetery, and has photographed many Victorian-era cemeteries in her travels, most recently the Cologne Cemetery in Havana, Cuba. Ladies and gentlemen, Sally Millick.
Hi, good morning, everyone. As I was saying, as people were coming in, it's great to see so many familiar names and faces in the chat. And as Brandon said, today's topic is the Seldens Seldom Remembered, which was my attempt at getting Brandon to get tongue-tied in the introduction. But I live on Selden Street, and here we see this street sign, and often we pass street signs and wonder, how did that street come to be named that particular name? And today we are going to talk about the Selden family that had originally come from Connecticut and originally from Lyme, Connecticut, but the family actually went back several generations, originally coming from England. And here are the gravestones of the several generations prior to the Seldens that came to Rochester. Here we have the stone of Ezra Selden and his wife, Elizabeth Selden, and we see here her genealogy. So you can see how far back the family goes. And there's also some interesting things here to talk about with the gravestone. And since this is Mourning in the Morning, just wanted to point out the beautiful carving on this 18th century, 1700s gravestone. And often these gravestones had these little sayings on them, and it was as if to speak to the viewer. And so in this case, hers says, "As I was, so are ye, as I am, you must be," meaning that once she was alive and now she's passed, and apparently you're standing there looking at her memorial. The next generation, Calvin and Phoebe Ely Selden, was still settled in Connecticut. And here we see a quote from their son Samuel, Judge Samuel Selden, who did come to Rochester. And he gives the background in a bio that he wrote. My father, Calvin Selden, was a respectable farmer. He was known for his benevolence, integrity, and sound judgment, and was an active community member there in Lyme, Connecticut. And the family stayed in Connecticut. We see here a program from a speech that was given in 1877 by a descendant of theirs, Daniel Cady Eaton, to a reunion that took place in Connecticut. The other thing I wanted to point out here as far as gravestones is that sometimes when you're in a Victorian cemetery, there's these small stones that people see, and it's unclear whether is this a child? Is this a stone that somehow sunk into the ground? If you look closely here, you can see the initials PES, which is for Phoebe Ely Selden. This is a footstone. So we call the headstone the headstone. In theory, that's where the head is, and where the deceased is laid, you'll see these footstones at the opposite end. So 3 of the Seldens made their way to Rochester, the first one being Elizabeth Selden. And we have a picture here of Elizabeth, obviously in later years. She had married Joseph Spencer, who practiced law in Rochester, and eventually he served in the first New York State Senate after the New York State Constitution was changed in 1821. They had one daughter, Elizabeth Spencer Colt, and Elizabeth's monument is over here in the lower right-hand corner. She did move back to Connecticut, but then after Spencer's death, Elizabeth remarried to General Amos Eaton, who we see here looking very general-like. And Eaton was the first cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, with Susan B. Anthony, led the women's suffrage campaigns in the 19th and early 20th century. And so I thought it was fitting in digging deeper on this part of the family that Amos and Elizabeth had 3 children, one of which was Frances Spencer Eaton. And Frances's daughter here is seen in a 1912 suffrage parade. On the right here is Elizabeth Selden Spencer Eaton, named after her grandmother and campaigning for the cause of women's suffrage, as her ancestor, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had done. The second Selden to make it to Rochester was Samuel. And again, I'll quote from his bio. In the spring of 1820, his father's health began to fail and he passed away. Well, I'm paraphrasing, not quoting. And he came to Rochester, where he entered as a law student in the office of his brother-in-law, Joseph Spencer, who he notes is a fine classical scholar as well as a lawyer. And then relates what I said, that Mr. Spencer was elected to the state Senate, but right after that first term, sadly, he passed away in Albany, which is what led to Elizabeth Spencer's remarriage. But Samuel Selden was a highly esteemed attorney and judge, and really moved very quickly into the judgeship from being an attorney. So in 1831, he was a county court judge in Monroe County. 1847, became a New York State Supreme Court justice. 1855, elected to the New York Court of Appeals, where he actually replaced his former law partner, Judge Addison Gardner, and then was the chief judge of the Court of Appeals in 1862. And again, he was very highly esteemed for his opinions, and he was frequently cited as in the contemporary legal treatises. Now, one thing common theme that comes through this generation of the Selden family is unfortunately poor health. And so at several times in his career, Samuel Selden and some other Seldens we'll talk about actually resigned their positions for health reasons, either to go away for treatment or just wary to take on more responsibility given their health. So, in fact, that was what led to his resignation from the county bench in 1833. And then he retired, going back. So he was then elected to the justice of the Supreme Court without really running for it. So he was out of town taking care of some health issues. And in his absence, he hadn't really taken the trouble to look at what the returns were. And then his brother Henry actually sent him a telegraph. This is not that telegraph, saying that you had been elected to be a justice of the Supreme Court. So the reason that I thought it was interesting to include this telegraph from the 19th century is that Samuel Selden was a major force in the early commercial applications of telegraph in Western New York, which led to the formation of Western Union. And we have a lot of the executives and board members of Western Union buried at Mount Hope Cemetery. In 1874, again, ill health forced Samuel Selden to resign from the board of directors of Western Union, but his brother Henry, who also was involved in the venture, was elected to the board in his place. And just like today, we take for granted our cell phones and our ability to communicate quickly. One has to remember that in the 19th century, there was no quick way to communicate. So even in the feeling that society and science and technology had advanced in the 19th century, you still basically had the same slow communication. If something happened, you were mailing messages or you went somewhere to inform people. So the telegraph was a really strong innovation that laid the ground for a lot of future innovations and discourse. So where is Selden Street? In the 1840s, Samuel bought property in the Grove Place neighborhood, which still is in downtown Rochester. And this whole section, which we see here in this old plat map, really became an enclave of the Selden and Ward families for decades. In fact, I think some of the Wards lived here into the 1960s or 70s. But the original Grove Place was this kind of enclave. You have Main Street here. This is actually where the Carlson YMCA building is now. Cherry Street became Windsor Street, and Gibbs Street, we know, so the Eastman Theater would be across the street from this. And here you see the name of the property owners. We have Henry Selden here. We have Theodore Bacon, who was Henry Selden's son-in-law, and we'll talk about his properties in a moment. And then various Seldens and Wards owning property all around this area. And this would have been the view from the corner of Gibbs Street, looking over, like if you were looking at the YMCA. So looking closer at this beautiful neighborhood, I mentioned that Theodore Bacon, Henry Selden's son-in-law, had built these beautiful townhouses that still stand, and they are one of Rochester's gems in terms of architectural example from the Tudor style of in the 1800s, the 19th century. And just showing some of the beautiful side detail. If you turn the corner here onto Selden Street, you see these beautiful windows with their leaded glass detail. And again, just giving you an idea of where this is in terms of a map. This building still stands also on Selden Street, either a barn or a carriage house for some of the families here. And these townhouses here do not exist. There was a fire in the early 1900s that took down a lot of these townhouses. These buildings here do exist though. So this area is where the YMCA building is, and this is no longer a thoroughfare. But here, this building does still exist, and across here, the downstairs cabaret theater. So the Seldens had an immediate influence, not only in terms of their law practices and so forth, but to the geography and the layout of our city. And they like to have fun. So a lot of people are not familiar with the history of baseball in Rochester, and this is not a Selden here in the picture, but baseball was a popular pastime. And I just here quoted from an article about the baseball clubs in Rochester and how the early players were Rochesterville newspaper editor Thurlow Weed, who played with other social prominent men, including attorney Addison Gardner, who I already mentioned, judge, Frederick Wisley, Judge Selden, and Dr. Frederick Bacchus, who was the first treasurer of Rochesterville, and the miller Thomas Kempschel. And I believe all of them are also buried at Mount Hope. And here we just have a quote from the Union and Advertiser in 1858 that players were aspiring gentlemen from the ages of clerks and schoolmasters down to scholars in our intermediate departments, which I think was a fancy way of saying that the game was attracting a lot of interest for people, for men of all ages. And you see here also that the players did not have the gear, the protective gear and so forth that we think is requisite today. There also is, if anyone's interested, a Rochester baseball history organization, if you want to look that up online. So Samuel Selden, in addition to his poor health, he did have some tragedies in his life. And here we see the Samuel Selden plot at Mount Hope. And his wife, Susan Ward Selden, and this monument here, which was their son, Henry, their son, Samuel, who passed within a year and a half of his birth, and then Samuel Selden himself here on the end. Now, the tragedy with Henry here is that Samuel had taken Henry to the Irondequoit Bay when he was 12 or 13 years old to teach him to swim. And while they were in the water, there must have been some type of underwater, drop off in the ground. But Henry started flailing and he actually drowned right in front of his father while his father obviously was trying to save him. So you can only imagine as a parent losing a child, to see them and to know that you were somewhat responsible. This really affected him the rest of his life, as it would anyone. And when we're looking at this stone, it's unique in several ways, because often you'll see these allegorical figures on cemetery monuments. And it's rare that you actually see a depiction of the person, of the deceased. But this appears to be a picture taken from a picture of Henry Selden, the son. And you see him in his 19th century clothing. He has a school book. He's leaning up against a tree. It looks like a tree stump. And that was a common Victorian motif to signify a life that was cut short, unusually young. And you also see these mourning glories here on the trunk, which signified, often you'd see these on child's graves because the mourning glories come out in the morning and then they're gone by dusk. And so again, signifying the tragedy of a short life in regards to this child. The inscription on Henry's stone is that he is not dead, this child of our affection, but gone unto that school where he no longer needs our poor protection, and Christ himself doth rule. And so apparently the parents were looking at it as he had gone off, just like we would send our kids off to college or school or some new experience. But unfortunately, he passed away. So then we come to Henry Selden, who was Samuel's brother, and he was one of the most respected attorneys in New York State. He began as a case reporter for the New York State Court of Appeals, and then joined the Court of Appeals due to Samuel's resignation, due to his health. And he put in an unusual amount of work. It was a very active season or span of time when he was on the Court of Appeals. In 30 months, they reviewed 273 cases. And just as a marker of the esteem that Henry's views had, he had written opinions on 53 of the cases, and in all but 2, his position was upheld by his peers and fellow judges. He was elected then, he re-elected for an 8-year term, but he resigned due to his health. And then later in 1866, he actually became a member of the New York State Assembly. So in his obituary in the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, we see here he was the superior of anyone who appeared in our courts during the period of his practice, more deeply read than any lawyer of his generation. No just estimate of his rank in the profession can fail from assigning him a place among the foremost lawyers in the state. But we'll see there's a lot more to Henry than just being an attorney and judge. So when Henry came to upstate New York, first he settled in Clarkson, New York, where he did build a law practice. And this is a photo of his house and the marker in front of it. And I'll give the photo credit to my Mount Hope board colleague, Deb Coffey, thank you. And this sign does capture that he was the lieutenant governor and the judge, and that his son, George, who we'll talk about a little later, was born in this house. So Henry was active in politics, but not to the level of running for office. So given his esteem and people's high opinion of him, he was frequently asked and nominated for office. But he tended to, he moved between several parties in his lifetime. And part of that is because the parties changed in his lifetime. But it seemed more that he followed his conscience rather than a particular platform. So in the first place, when he first came to the upstate New York area, he was a Jacksonian, then he became a Democrat, and then he started identifying with the new Republican Party. So let's just clarify, there's been a lot of platform changes since the Democrats and the Republicans in the 19th century to now. But one of the leading things of the evolving Republican Party was to argue against slavery. So he supported John Fremont, who was the first Republican candidate for president in the 1856 Republican Convention and campaign. So Fremont had come from California, and we see him here on his horse. He was known as an explorer and credited with bringing California into the United States. But he did not win the election. The Democrat James Buchanan won that election. And it was interesting looking up the platform of the 1856 Republican Convention. One of the things was it is to say that it is the duty of Congress to prohibit in the territories those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery, which makes me want to go back and point out that twins are not free. But there's the barbarism, polygamy, I think, was a reference to the Mormon settlements in Utah. And slavery, there was a lot of debate as new states were looking at joining the United States, whether they should be allowed if they allowed slavery. So in 1856, there was this convention called the Radical Democracy in New York, which was the beginnings of the Republican Party. And John King was the leader of the the evolving party in New York. And he was elected governor, and Henry Selden was elected the lieutenant governor. And between the two of them, Selden and King were the first two members of the Republican Party to win a statewide election. Moving to the national stage, Henry was a delegate in 1860 to the Republican Party convention in Chicago, and he supported William Seward for the presidency. And we see William up here in the corner. William became Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln's administration. He resided in Auburn, and again, his home is still open as a museum, and it's fascinating to look at all the interesting things people brought him from all over the world as in his role as Secretary of State. But he didn't win the nomination. After a few ballots, Abraham Lincoln was nominated as the Republican candidate for president. And at that point, Henry Selden was offered the nomination for vice president. He declined. Again, this is a pattern in his life. He did not seem to want to run for an office. But at his suggestion, the Maine Senator Hannibal Hamlin was offered a place on the ticket, and he became the vice president under Abe Lincoln. And we see here one of their flyers, free speech, free homes, free territory, the Union must and shall be preserved. So another thing that Henry Selden is noted for is his defense of Susan B. Anthony, definitely the most celebrated case of his career. Before going and registering and voting, Susan B. Anthony had actually run this by Henry Selden and his brother and asking if she had the right to vote. And the way that they looked at it under the 14th Amendment, that secured the rights of citizens to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. And so in his view, there was nothing stopping a woman from being able to vote because she was a citizen of the United States. And here we have a quote from Susan B. Anthony, who had written to Elizabeth Cady Stanton saying that honorary Henry Selden will be our counsel. He has read up on the law and all of our arguments, and he's satisfied that we are right. And ditto the old Judge Selden, Samuel. And then after she went and voted, Anthony wrote to Elizabeth Cady Stanton in Seneca Falls saying, I've gone and done it. I voted the Republican ticket. That was Ulysses S. Grant election. And then she goes in to talk about how other women went to register, and eventually some of the women were turned away. And then interestingly, when Susan B. Anthony was arrested and eventually came to trial, she was declared incompetent to be a witness in her own defense because she was female. So that was kind of a conundrum. So there was something very untoward about women. Well, even throughout this presentation, you'll notice that we're talking mainly about the Selden men. It was very difficult for me to find anything about the Selden women. But there was something very untoward about women going to jail, even if they had committed a crime. It was like today where we would not put a child in jail. And Susan B. Anthony wanted to go to jail, be put in jail, because she wanted to make the case that she was being held for no reason under the writ of habeas corpus, that she, because she did have the right to vote under the 14th Amendment. But unfortunately, Henry decided to pay her bail, so she was out of jail. And on the way out of the hearing, Anthony's other lawyer, John Van Voorhis, told Anthony that Selden's decision to pay her bail had made her lose her chance to get this in front of the Supreme Court. And when Anthony confronted Henry about this, he just said, "I could not see a lady I respected put in jail." But here's some of his argument. Without a share in the political powers of the state, no class of citizen has any security for its rights. And the history of nations to which I briefly alluded shows that women constitute no exception to the universality of this rule. Unfortunately, Judge Hunt, who was presiding over the proceedings here at the Ontario County Courthouse in Canandaigua, we see here, he had written his opinion before he heard any arguments, and he directed the jury after the trial was over to find Anthony guilty. He stated that the franchise of voting was a privilege, not a right, and its regulation was a matter of state regulation, not federal. Selden's request that the jury be individually polled on their opinion was refused, and as was his application for a new trial. So again, we see a lot of similar arguments going on today. Who has the right to say who is able to vote, and whether this is at the state or the federal level? But this all played out in Canandaigua in Susan B. Anthony's trial with Henry as her defense attorney. He also had, I wouldn't say he was an active abolitionist. And the reason I say that is because he was quoted as adhering to anti-slavery principles. And there's a story here that we'll share. But he didn't believe in legislating away slavery with the current slave owners. So it was kind of this opinion where we don't want to invite any more slavery into the country. However, we're not going to legislate against the slave owners and so forth right now. However, he was quoted as telling to his son George that he would die before surrendering a fugitive slave. Once the Fugitive Slave Act came into play, a lot of Northerners really started becoming aware that, not only aware morally that slavery was not a good thing, but the idea that they would be obligated to give up a fugitive slave to be sent back to his or her owner was just not going over well. And so here's an example where we have John Brown here on the left, kind of looking like Count Dracula, but he had organized a slave rebellion and a raid at the US Arsenal at Harper's Ferry in 1859. And John Brown had actually traveled to Rochester and discussed the raid with Frederick Douglass. And in my Underground Railroad tour at the cemetery, we quote from someone who was actually a witness to that meeting, and how Douglass did not think this was a good idea. He did not want to participate. But he was friends with John Brown. And so when John Brown was arrested after the raid, his bag had letters from Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists. And so warrants were issued for all those abolitionists arrest. And Douglas was in Philadelphia. He was coming back to Rochester, but by chance, Henry Selden was traveling to Rochester on a train, and he overheard a federal marshal bragging that he had come to arrest a runaway. And Selden put two and two together that he was talking about Douglas. And so when Selden came to Rochester, he went to Douglas's house to tell him that under the Fugitive Slave Act, the governor of New York State would be obligated to surrender him. And that in order to avoid this whole confrontation and bloodshed, Douglas should leave the country. Now, I think Douglas had already planned on traveling, but Selden was kind of like, now is the time to go. So Henry Selden loaned Frederick Douglass a horse on which he rode to Charlotte, where he was able to get an Underground Railroad boat over to Canada. And one of the Selden descendants was quoted in a brief book that she wrote, that the name of the man whose timely warning had enabled him to escape was not given in Frederick Douglass's book, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, until a reprint after Judge Selden had died in 1885. So that was interesting that Douglas respected Selden's privacy and obviously didn't want him getting into any bad light. But after he passed, in a reprint, he could give tribute to the fact that Henry had loaned him the horse and been instrumental in his escape. So this is a look at the Henry Selden plot at Mount Hope. And we see here Henry's gravestone, and what it says is, this is actually written by his son-in-law, Theodore Bacon, sometime lieutenant governor of this commonwealth, afterwards judge of its highest court. He counted nothing human to be alien to himself, and spent his life, his substance, and himself in the service of his fellows. So just to do a deeper dive on some of Henry's children, I mentioned that it was really difficult to find anything out about his daughters. And apparently there's no photos of these folks available, at least from what I could tell in my research. But his daughter, Julia Clark Selden, married Theodore Bacon. We can see Theodore here, and he was a Civil War veteran, and the Bacons are buried at Mount Hope. Theodore Bacon seemed like an interesting character, also an attorney, but quite an independent thinker. And he did try to run for some offices, but I think he was just a little too independent in his thinking. And there was just a snippet here of some complimentary comments that people had made about some speeches that he had given when he passed. This house here was the Bacon residence, and this is the corner of Main and Gibbs Street. So basically this house was taken down to clear the way for our beloved Eastman Theater. Again, right across the street from Grove Place. Similarly, Laura Henrietta Selden, the youngest daughter, very little I could find about her, no pictures, but her husband, William Ellwanger, was the son of the Ellwanger horticulturists here in Rochester, Ellwanger and Berry. And here's a picture of William, and it seemed that, again, the males of the family got a lot more esteem and recognition, and that's what I was able to find about Mr. Ellwanger. He was an attorney, but it seemed like he had a lot of other interests that he pursued. And then the other daughter, had married a judge, a man who became a judge, Francis A. Macomber, who ended up being on the Supreme Court bench 14 years. And then originally he went in as a Republican, and then after his service of 14 years, he was re-endorsed by all parties and re-elected without any opposition. His wife, Mary Selden, we have her obituary here that she had passed away. Again, it didn't seem like they were a very healthy family. She's here passing away around the age of 41 years old. When he finally passes away, in his obituary, there's no mention of Mary Selden, his wife. It's only mentioning the wife that he was married to at that time. And similarly, daughter Louise, no mention of any of her contributions, but I found it interesting that she actually had married Major General Elwell Otis. And for people who are familiar with Rochester history, Elwell Otis, General Otis, was active in the Civil War and a number of military positions up until he had a very high esteemed position in the Philippines. And then when he came back to Rochester, they built this, it's like a paper mache. This is the corner, this is East Avenue coming toward you and Main Street where the arch is. And they actually had Otis Day, June 15th, which was honored for a number of years. But when he came back, they built this huge arch designed by the architect Claude Bragdon and had this parade, and you can see the full military regalia here, and that building behind with the festoons on it still stands. So again, Louise Selden passed away at a fairly young age. General Otis went and remarried and went on, didn't pass away until 1909. So then we come to the most well-known of Henry Selden's children, and that is George Baldwin Selden. And George, you see his gravestone here at Mount Hope, which is part of the Henry Selden plot. And it says on the stone that he is the inventor of the gasoline automobile. Now, there's a lot of dispute around that, and we'll get into this, but before we do, George had actually enlisted in the 6th New York Cavalry at the beginning of the Civil War. He had attended Yale, but he really was more of a tinkerer and inventor. And he actually had several patents before the invention he had of the engine for the road carriage. But his father, Henry, really wanted him to be an attorney. And this is one of those interesting family things that we just went through Henry's life and all the things that he contributed and the support that he gave to Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. But apparently he was quite stern and unforgiving of his son. And it's really interesting as this evolves. So George, or Henry's saying, George, we really want, you should be a lawyer. So George studies law and becomes a patent attorney. He's interested in patents. He's still got this whole mechanical thing going on. And he actually successfully represented George Eastman in some patent matters. So, but meanwhile, he built himself a shop that I believe was behind some of these buildings on Selden Street. And he worked on a design of machinery to prepare barrel hoops. So the hoops that hold a barrel together. He actually had patents for a machine that shaved half-round hoops. He also secured patents for improvements to that product and eventually sold those patents. So he didn't try to make barrels, but he had that mechanical capability and interest. So in 1900, at a Buffalo district court, a judge affirmed that this patent for a gasoline-powered automobile was invented by George Baldwin Selden. Yet, George had never actually built the vehicle. And he had been experimenting with engines. And when we think of engines and road carriages, we think of these smaller things. But the first engines were huge. And so 8 feet tall, built more for factories than you would think of putting in a vehicle. And so what Selden became really interested in was how to take those huge engines and make them into something portable that could propel a vehicle. And he was doing all kinds of experiments, as there were also similar experiments going on in Europe with the Benz and other firms. In 1875, he built an engine driven by a mixture of laughing gas and kerosene, which not surprisingly was a failure. But it seemed that this was boiling down to what substance could be used as fuel. So we went from coal to steam, and now Selden started getting this idea of using an internal combustion engine using a liquid fuel. And that was the direction that he went into. So I have here a couple side notes. There's a picture of the road engine and the road carriage that he designed. And interestingly, who was the patent clerk that was working at the patent office where he filed it, but George Eastman. So George Eastman had been a client of George Selden, and he also was the clerk that witnessed this patent. And we see his signature down in the lower corner. So just to go back in the evolution of automobile development. So, and you can imagine, the visuals that come up in your mind when you're thinking about this. Imagine a three-wheeled cart with a large boiler hanging over the front, with 2 cylinders alternating, but you could drive it in reverse. Again, this is the rudimentary auto design. And in 1769, this vehicle could run for 15 minutes at 2 miles an hour. I think I can walk faster. In 1831, there were steam carriages in England, so kind of the beginning of buses. In 1860, there was experimentations with coal gas with a double-acting piston, and the flame was outside the cylinder, so this wouldn't apply to a vehicle because you wouldn't want to have an external fire going on. And in 1876, Nicholas Otto built the first modern internal combustion engine with a mixture of gas and air, but it still was, these were big, heavy machinery. And Otto is of interest, and we'll talk about him more in a moment. In 1872, the components of the Brayton cycle, and we see that here, this consisted of a compressor, a turbine, a heat exchanger, and a combustion. This is the engine that George Selden, I believe he saw it at like a world exposition, and this was a huge machine, but this is what got him thinking about, okay, how can I take this technology and make this into a smaller, more portable engine? So that's called the Brayton engine versus the Otto engine. So he applied for the patent in 1879, and some say he kind of consciously drew that out. He hadn't built the vehicle. He had only taken out the patent. And it was almost as if he had taken out the patent, waiting for someone else to build on his idea. But a lot of other auto companies were already using this engine design. And again, the Selden patent specifically covered the use of an internal combustion engine for the purpose of propelling a vehicle. And then he, because all these other auto manufacturers had started manufacturing autos, I'd said on a previous slide that there was this declaration in 1900 that validated this patent. And the result of that was all these auto manufacturers had to pay Selden a royalty to continue using his technology in their vehicles. So a group called the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers was formed. Several major manufacturers joined this group, including Cadillac, Winton, Packard, Locomobile, Knox, and Peerless. And for 11 years, Selden was able to collect fees from all these auto manufacturers. And we see here this ad in a paper saying about gasoline automobiles. United States letters patent granted to George B. Selden in 1895 controls broadly commercial forms of gasoline automobiles. Licenses under this patent have been secured from the owners by the following named manufacturers. And here you see a lot of the prominent auto manufacturers of that day. as well as some of imports. So meanwhile, Henry Ford was innovating more in the lines of the Otto engine. So Henry Ford had initially applied for membership to that group, but for some reason they rejected his application. And the owners of the patent, the Selden patent, which the owners were the electric vehicle company, tried to continue this control of the industry, but then the patent rights were not due to expire until about 1912. So here we have a notice that the Ford company came out saying that we will protect you against any prosecution for alleged infringement of patents. Regarding alleged infringement of the Selden patent, we beg to quote the well-known patent attorney, blah, 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 blah. So they are publicly arguing that car manufacturers don't have to ascribe to that patent, because the Selden patent, because there are other ways to build these engines. Meanwhile, the autos that did have the licensed Selden patent often had this plaque. So you wouldn't have found this plaque on a Ford. The argument between the two, the Selden patent and Ford, went on from 1903 to 1911. And though not a lot of people had heard of Henry Ford, certainly that exposure was very helpful in him building his empire. But the final decision came down that Selden's patent was not being infringed upon by Ford because it was valid only for an automobile driven by a Brayton type engine of the specific type described in the patent. Now, Selden, again, hadn't built a car, so in some debate, he actually did build a car, and he and his sons went to New York City to demonstrate that the patent on their car actually worked. And here we have some pictures of that. So we have George Selden himself here on the right in a car powered by his original engine built in 1877. The picture was taken in New York during patent litigation. And there's other men in the picture. What they did is they built the car, and then they put 1877, which was not the year that the car was built. It was the year that he had invented the engine. And so they went and took the car for a ride around New York, and there was some sputtering and further argument. But it did produce these great pictures of the Selden car and what it would have looked like. And then we also have a picture here of Selden looking very inventor-like here in a lab. Now, despite their ongoing public dispute, Ford and Selden actually respected each other. So during the trial, Selden had said, "Personally, I'm on good terms with Mr. Ford, and I rather admire the business skill with which he's managed his enterprise." And for his part, Ford had no personal animosity towards Selden. He was a decent old fellow, he later remarked. And again, in this patent litigation opportunity in New York City, we have a picture of Henry Ford being driven by George Selden in the Selden vehicle. And this was just a funny meme I found online. So after that was settled, the Seldens actually did start building cars. And here is just a magnificent example. In 1911, there was a car presented to Mr. Treat here, and we have the tires, the Goodrich quick detachable tires, and just this fabulous 1911 car, which was a gift from the Shriners to Mr. Treat. And here's some other advertising I found. And again, it's funny to look back on advertising and just the way things were presented. But here we have the Selden car for 1909, made by the man who invented gasoline automobiles. Like, this was something that George was not going to give up. We see in this ad here, the Selden Car, made by the father of them all. And then the different models were available and more detail about the cars themselves. But my favorite part of this middle ad is some of the quotes that came out of your customer testimonials. So I wish to compliment you on the Selden Car, writes a wealthy gentleman who is considered an expert judge and has in his garage several other cars, each of which cost from $1,000 to $3,000 more than his Selden. And this one, on carefully looking it over, my former good opinion of it, the Selden Car, has gone up 50%. Many a poorly built car, ornate with tinsel, brass, and colored varnish, has fooled people who looked at it 10 feet away. But it takes a car like the Selden to stand close critical inspection. And of course, my question is, why did his opinion go up 50%? Why not 45? Why not 70? It's the best car at anything approaching its price, which I have any knowledge. So again, it's just funny to read some of these. And then over here, we have this postcard from a pharmacy in Hawaii that had tried to capture the great achievements of the previous 60 years. And they're honoring these titans of industry, right? So we have Alexander Graham Bell inventing the telephone here, and Edison with the electric light, this medication. And then over here, we have George Selden, the inventor of the automobile, along with Lindbergh and other notables. Just funny paper history. So the Selden Cars did build up quite a following, and the company did well. You see some statistics here on the right that they were producing somewhere between 800 and 1,200 cars a year. The last Selden Cars were built in 1914. They did come in several models, and they were all powered by a four-cylinder 30 to 40 horsepower engine. But after that, they actually got into trucks and manufactured these Liberty trucks. And here we see a picture of these Selden Liberty trucks on East Main Street during the Liberty Loan Drive in 1918, World War I. So due to the high demand for trucks in World War I, the US Army drew up a spec for a standard Class B heavy truck. Many Model Bs were built by Selden in Rochester. Eventually, over 8,000 Liberties were sent to France during the war. Other Model B builders were these other manufacturers. So once they finally started manufacturing cars, they did meet with some success. But again, Selden would never abandon the fact that he was the father of it all. So Samuel and Henry Selden were instrumental in bringing the telegraph to Rochester and beyond. And the companies that were formed eventually became Western Union, at one point the largest provider of telegraphic services in the United States. In 1851, in addition to his lawyer work and judgeships, Henry Selden was one of the investors in Samuel's ventures, and he became the president of the New York and Mississippi Valley Telegraph Company. He was also the representative attorney for the telegraph company, being appointed in 1856. In July of 1874, again, Samuel Selden resigned his position, and Henry took a position on the board as well as being the representative attorney. This all stemmed from, in 1832, Samuel Morse had invented the single-wire electric telegraph and received a patent for the device in 1838. And then 5 years later, he obtained a grant from Congress to build an experimental line between Baltimore and Washington. And so, as I talked about earlier in the program, this was a huge move forward in terms of communication. And here we have Samuel Morse holding his single wire electric telegraph. However, in 1846, a man by the name of Royal House, which is just a fantastic name, Royal House patented a rival device. And his device actually, instead of just sending over the Morse code, it printed out letters. So it's more what we consider what became the telegraph that you would see, or written message. And that required higher quality wire, more insulation, and some different technology. But Henry Selden was one of the initial house patent holders. And in 1849, he took the lead in organizing the New York State Printing Telegraph Company. So you have the Morse and the house patents coming together in this organization. And now you have all these telegraph companies being, telegraph lines being built. And in 1851, the New York and Mississippi Valley Printing Telegraph Company was formed and built a telegraph line from Buffalo to St. Louis. And this also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention another prominent historian, Henry O'Reilly, who has his own story, but he played a prominent role in the spread of telegraph across the US. So in our tours at Mount Hope, we talk about Hiram Sibley being the first president of Western Union. And he, in 1854, he did recapitalize the company under the name of Western Union and began a very aggressive program of construction and acquisition. Hiram Sibley had been the sheriff, and he also was quite an entrepreneur. And in him taking reins of the company, they completed the first transcontinental telegraph line, which enabled fast coast-to-coast communications during the Civil War. In 1866, the Western Union introduced the first stock ticker, which we see here in this beautiful photograph, which provided brokerage firms with New York Stock Exchange quotations. So the tickers that we see now electronically, that originally was by the telegraph. And then Henry Selden remained involved in the company until July of 1874. And for those of us who did not, well, those of us who did and did not grow up with Western Union, I mentioned how this was such an innovation similar to the cell phone and the telephone for that matter. Here we see, I believe this is the 1939 World's Fair, a travel tip for World's Fair visitors. Telegraph, if you're on a business or pleasure trip, you will make your trip more enjoyable for yourself as well as the folks at home and business associates if you send them a daily Western Union tourist telegram. And so again, this was a way similar, I guess, an electronic postcard, right? You're going to send them a message. You can have additional words put on for a few cents more. You have 35 cents for the first 15 words. In the middle here, we have a general operating department of Western Union, that all these telegraphy machines would be in effect, and people would be taking the incoming messages and sending the outgoing messages. And then here we have the correctly uniformed Western Union messenger. So when you received a telegram, there would be a messenger in some cases who would come and deliver. And here was their standards, where he's got his pencil and his hat. He's got his sleeves at the correct length. His uniform is pressed and spotless, clean hands and face, shoes shined, no worn heels, high top shoes polished. So this was the standard for the Western Union messenger. So after hearing all this, as far as all the contributions that Henry Selden made to the telegraphy, he obviously was able to have the vision of how important this innovation was, what the telegraph would bring to Americans and, really people worldwide. And yet there's an irony here that he was not only discouraging of Georgia's experiments with the engine, but he kind of ridiculed it. And one of the books I read in preparing this presentation, a book called Drive, which was a story of Selden and Ford and Benz and all these innovators, pointed out that had Henry Selden shared only a few of the extensive contacts he had and business contacts he had as he pulled together Western Union, if he had shared any of that with George, that could have been the entree of George into the auto industry. And it's just interesting to me that Henry could see the viability of the telegraph, but he couldn't see the viability of this engine, portable engine that his son was building. So is that family dynamic? Is it just a blind spot? But I found that a really interesting point. And it also kind of brings together that the Seldens, for all their esteem and contributions, are a family like any other family. Oh, there's George experimenting with his engine in the shed again, and kind of discounting what that industry has become. So our last Selden today is Henry Selden Bacon. And Henry Selden Bacon, this is not Henry Selden Bacon in the picture. That is the former French Premier Georges Clemenceau, the World War I premier who oversaw the Treaty of Versailles. But he was a close friend of Henry Selden Bacon. And Henry Selden Bacon was the son of Theodore Bacon and Henry Selden's daughter. And we can just read here from the article that Mr. Bacon was long a friend of the French premier, and Mr. Bacon was primarily responsible for the premier's visit to the United States in 1925. And then we can see just some of the things we've talked about today. Descendant of a well-known Rochester family, Mr. Bacon was the son of the late Theodore and Julia Clark Selden Bacon. He formerly resided at 130 Gibbs Street, the house that we saw that was raised for the Eastman Theater. Since 1940, he resided in New York, where he practiced law. He had practiced law for 20 years in Paris, and it goes through his whole biography that he was in World War I. He was appointed a captain in the Army Signal Corps and promoted to major in 1919. He served with the American delegation at the Versailles Peace Conference, and he was primarily responsible for establishing the National Monument in memory of George Clemenceau here. So just to wrap, he was the last of his immediate family, and he was survived by a niece and 2 nephews. And then to bring it full circle back to our beautiful cemetery, he will be buried at the family plot at Mount Hope Cemetery at the convenience of his family. And this here is the Bacon plot, kind of put apart here by a tree between his parents. So much for nothing coming between them. And Henry Selden's gravestone is right here in the front at Mount Hope. So that is my set of vignettes about the Selden family. Does anyone have any comments or questions that I can help with or that you'd like to share with the group?
You have a remarkably diverse story with just this one family.
Thanks, Doug.
And it's terrific research you've done there. It was interesting that you quoted Henry Selden regarding paying the fine of Susan B. Anthony at the trial. That's not been well known. I'm assuming you got that through the Selden papers at the U of R?
Yeah, various sources.
Bail.
Because my father had been a good friend of George B. Selden Jr., who told my father that everybody says her fine was never paid. His grandfather, George B. Selden, said that Henry Selden did pay it. And when my father was quoted elsewhere, everybody was denying that.
I think there's 2 different fines here. I don't
Okay.
think she ever paid the fine that she was fined when she was determined guilty. The bail that he paid was when she was first arrested.
With bail, okay.
And she wanted to be held in the jail because then she's, hey, I'm being held against my will. I didn't do anything. So I think there's 2 different that she didn't pay the fine, to my knowledge, of her guilty fine.
Okay, that's what my father understood George Selden Jr. to be saying, and I'll have to check a little further on this, but, and of course, it never was appealed.
Right.
It did not go to the Supreme Court. Another interesting member of this family was Henry's grandson, Bill Selden, founder of the Cuba Theater.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And also you showed a photograph of a stock ticker. Thomas Edison's first invention, first patent, was for a stock ticker. And I wondered if George Selden, being so prominent in the patent field, whether he ever conversed or corresponded with Thomas Edison
about it. Yeah, I'm not sure, but that's something to look at. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, Sally?
Hi.
I believe George was finally fired by Eastman for not being aggressive enough in court. And I think he was also an early mentor to George in photography.
Say that
I
again.
think I
George
believe
Eastman.
I believe Seldman was one of the early photographers in Rochester and mentored George Eastman in the art of photography. Also, later on, George fired Selden
as
Eastman
his
fired
attorney.
Selden because he wasn't aggressive enough. And then Selden became an attorney opposing Eastman in other suits.
Interesting.
Yeah. Great explanation of the patent fight, by the way.
Oh, thank you. It really, I've been kind of stressed about this because it's complicated.
Well, it did make a lot.
Also, as you do more research, again, I've been a guide and researcher at Mount Hope for years, and I learned a lot. I had always put more of the Western Union on Hiram Sibley than I understood how much the Seldens did. Reverend Swartz.
Yeah, what section of Mount Hope is the one picture you had of the four tombstones with the 12-year-old boy in it? What section of Mount Hope is that in? Because I know where the others are.
I believe that's G. Dennis, it's so if you're at Mount Hope at the flat end, right, the south end, and there's that big the Sylvan Waters, the big sinkhole, the big kettle hole that's filled with water with a fountain. Right. So if you're walking along there, and there's a turnoff to the right, just past those kettle holes. And that is right, there's a retaining wall, and there's those graves are right there.
Okay, thank you.
I believe that is G.
Dennis also chimed in that it is.
It made a lot of sense that Selden strung out the patent application by filing constant amendments that would cause it to be reevaluated all over, because a patent was good for only 17 years. And if it had been granted initially, the market for automobiles would not have grown enough to be able to produce many royalties. It was better to wait until the manufacturing market was more mature so that there would be more revenue. And just by way of comparison, the inventor of the ruby laser filed a patent for that, and it was delayed for decades before being granted, which was fortuitous because there would have been no market for his patent on lasers until those many years later that it actually was granted, and he made a ton of money from that. So Selden's strategy was very sensible.
Yeah, and to your point, because he had delayed it, that's why the patent didn't run out until 1912. Had he just done that, from the time that he invented it, it would have run out a lot earlier. Other questions, comments?
We do have a couple of comments in the chat that I would.
Oh, great. I haven't looked yet.
Record. There are a couple from Cynthia Hauk. First
Hi,
off,
Cynthia.
First one is Sally. The old photo of Grove Place is actually a view looking south towards East Main Street, as if you were standing where the current Carlson YMCA is located. In the distance is the site of the current Eastman Theater. Might want to flip back to that image.
Yep. Do that.
Yeah, this is Cynthia Hauk speaking.
Hi.
That is how I've always seen that described when that photograph is included in the Rochester images and elsewhere, that the photo you're seeing with that sort of dirt driveway going down toward that fence, you are looking directly down the driveway at East Main Street. So you're looking south, and in the distance would have been where the Eastman Theater eventually was
I see what you're
located.
saying.
Yeah.
I see. So
You
so
had it,
here
you had it the other way around, that you were standing where the Eastman Theater was
got it.
and looking.
That's
And my other comment had to do with, you mentioned William Ellwanger married Laura Selden.
Mhm.
And when looking at the beginnings of the Landmark Society, there's never been a really in-depth biography of the founder of the Landmark Society of Western New York, who is Helen Ellwanger. So starting to look into that backstory about Helen Ellwanger, it was fascinating to find out about that William, her uncle, and his wife, together with another surviving son of George Ellwanger, were really underhanded swindlers. They were, and they
Let's gossip.
well, this is not gossip. This is
Yeah.
greatly, this is intensely recorded in newspapers. When George Ellwanger died in 1906, he had an estate of $2 million, and it became the largest estate to be probated in surrogate's court, and it was in the state. And coverage of that probate, of that will, was extensive because it came to trial. Helen and Margaret Ellwanger's dad had died earlier, and they were living with their mom next door to Grandpa George. Next to that house was William and his wife Laura. So the three houses in a row on Mount Hope Avenue. William and his brother George had convinced their father to sign a second codicil to his will that would reduce Helen and Margaret Ellwanger's bequest to $30,000 apiece, when the original will was going to give them $250,000 apiece. Helen and Margaret's widowed mom hired attorneys for each of her daughters, and they went to court and they won. The codicil, the second codicil, was nullified. They said George Ellwanger Sr. was not competent when he signed it. There is extensive coverage of the testimony of William Ellwanger. His wife was called to testify. She made a lot of excuses because then their three daughters would have gotten more money. So and this was all over the press. But of course, this soap opera did not last in terms of recent history until researching into the archives. So I would say William, though he was an attorney, and Laura had questionable ethics, to say the least.
Sounds like we need to do a preso on the Ellwangers.
And they're all buried together in the same plot, which is additionally amusing.
The plot thickens.
Yeah, because didn't one of the Ellwangers have something to do with the architecture of the Civic Center too? Am I remembering that?
I don't recall that particular item, but I always wondered how Helen and Margaret could become philanthropists. And if you were inherited $250,000 in 1908, that translates into millions of dollars today.
One other comment about Susan B. Anthony, to the dismay of most historians and other fans of Susan B., the last previous president of the United States pardoned her.
Yeah. Yeah.
She probably rolled over in her grave because she did not want to be pardoned.
Interesting principles.
While we're on the topic of Susan B., Dennis Carr pointed out that we know that her fine, so the actual fine, was never paid because she had no grounds for appeal. if she'd paid the fine, there would have been grounds for appeal.
Well, that's interesting because when George Selden spoke with my father, it was kind of whispering that he said that Selden said, people don't know this, but he paid her fine. And those were the words. So I don't know. It does involve further research.
No.
Question, was there any relationship between the Cunningham car manufacturing here and the patent that Selden had? Or is that?
That I don't know. I know that Cunningham produced cars, very beautiful cars here in Rochester. Does anyone have more info on that?
Seemed to me I read somewhere that there was some relationship to the patent that Selden had, but I don't recall what.
Well, the Cunninghams didn't start producing cars until the 20th century. They were carriage manufacturers. So I don't know how that affects the machinery that they were using in their cars.
Yeah.
They certainly started producing cars at a time period when the patent would have still been in effect. Just knowing, I'm more familiar with their trucks than I am with their cars, to be honest, but they were making large numbers of trucks by World War I. So they were definitely an established manufacturer and must have started at a time period when the patent would have been a potential issue for them.
Oh, so Joe Struble, are you still there?
I'm here, but I can't, I lost my little square. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. But you
Okay.
had made a comment in the comments. Joe had a long career at the Eastman House. You want to just share what you wrote?
Yeah, I remember this very brittle little album, and it would be called the Selden album, and it had I guess they're gelatin printing out paper prints of the workshop, like it's in a little alleyway, and a couple views of this barrel splitting invention. And there were some views of the house, which is this, you didn't have any of those, but it was this really impressive Italianate house in that little Gibb Street area. And he actually took some very serious photographs of that house and submitted them to a couple of these amateur contests that photographers of that era participated in. But the little album was nice, and I can't quite remember if it was one of the children that put together this album, but there was some views out their window of St. Peter's Church, I think, in that little neck of the woods. So I just didn't know how aware you or anybody was of that. If you wanted to see it, they would probably make a big deal about handling it because it's kind of falling apart. But
Sure.
it's an important little contribution that you might want to check into.
No, and thanks for that. I know there is an Italian house that still stands in this neighborhood, and it was hard first of all, I tried to research his other patents and I couldn't find anything. So that's really interesting what you're saying, that there's pictures of the barrel thing. There is an Italian house still here. I don't know who lived in it, but there also was an alley. I'm just motioning out the window here as if you can see. If you go up Selden Street, there was an alley before the Theodore Bacon townhouses that now goes into the parking lot of those townhouses. And so that might fit. So good, more stuff to research.
Yeah, good. Check it out.
And then you also commented about the Henry Selden, the child's picture.
Yeah, that if he died in 1858, there wasn't much paper photography around. So it would have had to been something like a daguerreotype, but more likely an ambrotype, or maybe even a tintype. But most of those were not full figured like that. But it could be, and I'm just curious if if that image ever surfaced at the Historical Society. It's not at the Eastman House, as far as I can tell. So I thought it was curious. I
I
love sculptures made of photographs. I think, like the Iwo Jima Memorial is a sculpture of a photograph. And I just thought that was kind of curious.
Yeah, I would imagine it was not all, if it was from a photograph, I don't think he would have been photographed leaning up against a tree stump with morning glories, for example. So I think there's definitely some artistic license, but the outfit is very 1850s. And I'm not sure exactly where the photo came from, but I do know that it's the image of the boy. And then wanted to shout out, I don't know if Margaret Murphy is still with us, but she commented that this presentation brings back to her hometown of 70 years. She's watching from Northern Virginia. Love Zoom access. That's great. Great. Thanks for joining. And then we have Dennis. Oh, and there's Margie. So Margie, you still with us?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. You want to comment your comment?
Oh, sure. Well, as some of you know, I've gone through many of the papers that rare books and special collections, the Hiram Sibley papers, and there are wonderful letters that written by Hiram Sibley and to Hiram Sibley during this period of the formation of Western Union that talks about, talks about the Selden role in the formation, talks about, I don't think he was felt that he was very well treated by Selden. There were a lot of politics, as one can only imagine. My particular joy in regards to Hiram Sibley is that quite soon after Western Union was established, his youngest child was conceived and born. That was Emily Sibley Watson. And I just like to imagine that in a moment of great abandon and joy, he celebrated. And then the difference between Emily's upbringing and the life of luxury that family lived as a result of the fortune that Western Union brought to them.
Yeah.
Compared with her older sister, who very few people know about, Louise Sibley Atkinson, who was always mindful of money and always concerned that she and her husband didn't have enough money, and that she was a burden on them because she was sickly. Totally different life experiences, which is just interesting to see the result that this kind of business deal can bring. And then, of course, Emily Sibley Watson married James Sibley. Emily Sibley married James Sibley Watson, which brought together more of that Western Union money from both sides of that family, concentrated it very nicely. It was a love marriage, but it was a good business opportunity too.
Yeah.
But although Hiram Sibley at that point had died, but in any event, it's just very interesting to really read this firsthand, interchanges about the business. Yeah. So in case anybody's wanting to see more, you can contact me. I've inventoried a lot of this material. So
yeah, no, you're a
thank you,
great
Sally.
resource.
I love the way in which all these stories merge.
That's what we do. That's why we do what we do.
It is. Thank you.
But thank you. Yeah, Joe. So Joe, I'm just looking at this again, and here's St. Peter's Church right here at the top of this. So if what you were saying about the little book, if you were on Gibbs and you were looking out the window, you would see St. Peter's Church there that burned down and is now a park.
Yeah, that's what I remember about.
No, it isn't.
It's just a nice little album, and there was even this odd thing in there. There was this frog, a stuffed specimen of a frog posed on a little bicycle, and there was a line underneath it like another invention or another patent failed or something like that.
Well, that also brings to mind, and this is another thing that I'd like to present on at some point, is the wards. And when you talk about a frog, and a stuffed frog, I think of taxidermy and all the innovation that Henry Ward with his company now, Ward's Natural Science, still is run out of Rochester, that supplies all the science specimens to schools and so forth. So might have been something to do with Henry too. Other questions or comments? Great conversation.
I've always wanted to see one of those original Selden cars. I understand Jay Leno owns one. I don't know of any others locations, but
yeah, let me hold on.
Sure.
Because I think in one of the slides, they were talking about the car. Because a lot of the car history I took from the online. Maybe it's in my notes, but there's a note about they created the car. Here we are. Oops. While going, let me get rid of my thing here. While going through the courts, he did manage to produce 2 vehicles. The first car was put together. The second car was, so I have in my notes where these 2 cars that they talk about here are.
Okay, because that first car had been out in Honeywell Falls at the so-called Wolfsburger Park owned by Harry Schoaf. And he had begged that car off of one of the Seldens, probably from Elm Place over in Avon. Mm-hmm. But Schoaf's estate was auctioned off 50 years ago. And I never learned what happened to that particular car after that. Schoaf had left it outdoors, which was not a good idea.
Yeah. Any other comments?
Do you know whether any other auto museums in the country have one of these?
I don't know about this car, but I do know that I went to, there's an antique car museum in the state park at Saratoga. And I was there a couple of years ago and of course was looking to see if Selden was mentioned. And they had quite a lot of examples of different Selden vehicles, but I don't remember. I wasn't studying this at this point, so there might be one there. I was surprised to find an auto museum in the middle of a state park, but that's a whole other story. Anything else? Well, thank you so much for joining today. And it's just great to continue this conversation, especially with those of us who do a lot of this research, and also to share with people who might drive by Selden Street or a number of streets and wonder, gee, where did that street name come from? And then to think if it was the 19th century, everyone would know the Selden name. And so again, thanks for joining. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to post them or get in touch with me through the library.
Thank you for joining us again today, Sally. And we hope to see you all next month for our presentation on March 12th. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.